Good morning, everyone. Welcome to your morning briefing for 25 March 2025. This is Robert standing in for Mike. Let's get inside the Beltway. First, the Trump administration is invoking state secrets in this deportation case under Judge James Boasberg. This is the Enemy Aliens Act case, where the Trump administration deported around 200 to 250 alleged Trinidad members to El Salvador. And yesterday, the Department of Justice said they're going to refuse to hand over the flight data from those deportations to the judge. And they said that this is because this disclosure would pose a risk to national security and foreign affairs. And this was after Boasberg ruled that his temporary restraining order on deportations is going to stay in place until these potential deportees can challenge their connections to Trinidad. And one of the big stories that broke yesterday is from The Atlantic, and their chief editor, Jeffrey Goldberg, said he was inadvertently added to a Signal group chat that included a bunch of Trump officials, including Vice President J.D. Vance, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. And he said that there was classified information about Houthi targets in Yemen shared in this chat. And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said that there were no classified plans were shared. I've seen a lot of speculation about the nature of this leak. And, historically, these kind of leaks have happened that were done purposefully, a couple of times in the Nixon administration. And people ask, well, why did one of the officials have Jeffrey Goldberg's contact information in their phone? Well, it is common for federal officials to basically, do controlled leaks by talking to reporters on background or anonymously. But I think in this case, the simplest explanation, and what I think is likely right now, is just that it was a snafu, basically, by Mike Waltz, who had apparently added Jeffrey Goldberg to the group chat. And then the FCC is beginning an investigation into Chinese-based telecom companies. They said they're evading a ban on operating in the U.S. and selling telecommunications equipment that poses a risk to national security. And this is a follow-on to actually an investigation by the Biden administration that started last year on some of these Chinese telecoms. The Foundation for Defense of Democracy said that there have actually been reports that telecom companies on the FCC's what's called the covered list, which are these Chinese telecoms that are banned from operating in the U.S. or selling equipment to U.S. companies, have actually sold rebranded telecommunications equipment after being added to the list in 2021 and 2022. And it's called white label, which they sell basically unbranded equipment to other companies, which then put their own brand on them. And this is important because the U.S. does remain vulnerable to cyber attacks and intrusions on key networks, including critical infrastructure, telecoms, and supply chains that we've covered pretty extensively over the last 2 years. And these telecoms that are linked to the Chinese Communist Party and also subject to China's national security law that requires them to cooperate with Chinese intelligence operations are, I think, likely distributing network-connected equipment through these white label sales, and also U.S. subsidiaries that broke off like TP-Link. And this would expand the reach of Chinese cyber operations in the United States and act as future nodes for intrusions and cyber attacks in some areas that where a lot of these network connected Chinese made devices probably still exist, or local and state governments and private businesses that are still using these Chinese made network connected devices, including surveillance cameras that are network connected. And if you look at this map, you can also see these are China Telecom, one of those covered entities that they have what are called points of presence, which are physical connection points for the internet and telecommunications that are still present in the U.S. and could be used to intercept, internet traffic, telecommunications traffic, or even facilitate cyber attacks. And Jared, if you could come on, we were talking about this before the show, and you actually had a really good question about this.
Yes. So I asked you how they were even getting around these, and the rebranding is interesting, but how is Huawei at all even getting the technology into the US to rebrand? Or are they doing it outside the US? How does this work?
Yeah, I'm sure they're doing it outside the US because there are a lot of the companies that, you saw. A good example of this is the solar industry. So the Department of Commerce started investigating, I think we reported on it in late 2023, where these third-party country manufacturers of like solar panels, they were getting components from China, or partnering with in joint partnerships with Chinese companies, and selling them under the label of the Vietnamese company or the Thai company into the U.S. to avoid sanctions and tariffs and import limits on those components. So I'm sure that Huawei, and some of these other Chinese hardware manufacturers, they're doing the same thing. They're selling to third countries, and it's, these third countries are acting as effectively a pass through for these Chinese network connected devices.
Okay. Did the FCC at least publish a list of the white label brands so that at a very minimum government officials can avoid it, right?
Yeah, there's a list of these what's called the covered list that's published on the FCC website, and they lay out the companies. It also includes this company China Telecom, I think China Unicom, ZTE, Huawei, and a couple of network connected security camera manufacturers. Now, the previous investigation by the FCC under the Biden administration, they didn't publicly publish those reports, as far as I understand. But this is, I'm sure, a follow-on to those investigations that started last year into the, this white labeling of Chinese hardware.
Okay.
All right. And moving on to our roll-ups. The Department of Interior is considering a land sale of 625 square miles of federal lands that are managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And the idea is this will be used for housing development. And the Interior Department said it's going to work with housing and urban development to target what they called underutilized federal land suitable for up to 7 million homes. And a Korean car manufacturer, Hyundai, announced that it's going to invest $21 billion in the U.S. through 2028. And the idea is to boost U.S. production of its vehicles and some other projects, including Hyundai saying they are going to build a steel mill in Louisiana with the explicit intention to strengthen the U.S. steel supply chain. This is something I've been seeing for the last month or so. A lot of foreign and U.S.-based car manufacturers are talking about moving production back to the U.S. or investing foreign direct investment into production in the U.S., which I think is a direct response to the tariff threats on auto part imports from Mexico and Canada. Because a lot, the U.S. car manufacturers, they get like 80% of their parts through those two countries, and sometimes they act, I think, as Jared reported a couple of weeks ago, they act as pass-throughs for other countries' parts, including China. And then finally, the Alaskan Governor Mike Dunleavy is in South Korea today and tomorrow, and he's meeting with South Korea's acting president, industry minister, and the U.S. ambassador to Korea, and they're going to discuss Korea's investment in Alaska's natural gas production and supply lines. So this is another data point pointing toward the Trump administration, being serious about developing this Alaska energy hub, and there seems to be some movement on foreign direct investment in that energy hub. And Jared, if you could come on and take us through your roll-up items for today.
Absolutely. So the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, he said yesterday that the U.S.'s steel and aluminum tariffs actually violate the USMCA, and that Canada needs to, quote, have a general conversation with the Americans about economics and security. Now, this still kind of tries to fall under the tough talk against Trump, saying, oh, well, you violated the rules. But I do want to note that having a general conversation and speaking about economics and security cuts right to the heart of what the point of the tariffs are. So that tells me that the Canadian Prime Minister, who is set to take he's projected to take a 40-seat lead in the Parliament, take an absolute majority. That tells me that Carney is going to take this in a practical approach, and we're probably going to see most of the relations between Canada and the U.S. return to normal once he can properly form a government in about May.
Well, yeah, this seems like, I think you talked about it a little bit yesterday, that there's kind of this race between Pierre Poilievre and Mark Carney on who is going to be the best person to deal with Trump, and that's the center of basically their fight in the election for prime minister right now. So how do you see? You mentioned some, the possibility of security vulnerability on the northern border that we haven't had to deal with previously. So do you see this as a return to, or a diminishing of that potential security vulnerability?
I I think so. One of my main concerns, all the way up to yesterday, was that they would end up purity spiraling into, well, who can be the harshest on Trump, not who necessarily can be the most effective with Trump. And if you end up going down the harshness route, it comes down to, well, how can you just spite him? And that is a security issue. But here it sounds much more like Carney's not necessarily totally backing off of that, so there is still a risk, I think, but it's much lower than what I was thinking. Because addressing the core issues of economics and security will actually, it will help Canada figure out how to play properly with the United States in the new Trump administration. Then moving on over to Iran, speaking of things kind of cooling down a little bit, Iran's foreign minister told his state media that he's confident there will be no war with the United States because Iran is fully prepared for war. Basically, Iran achieved deterrence in his opinion. That we'll we'll leave that assessment how it is. Now, he also added that the negotiations on like the nuclear deal will only be indirect with the United States as long as the maximum pressure campaign is ongoing. So what that tells me is that he's really trying to get the maximum pressure campaign lifted off. That way they don't have to go through intermediaries like Russia, who's offered to be a third party between Iran and the United States for negotiations on this.
Yeah, it's also, to me, that sounds like they are saying they're open to what's called track two negotiations. And that's something really common in the Gulf states between the US and some of the Gulf states. So track two negotiations are when you send someone like, a business person or an academic or, someone who is not an ambassador to negotiate on, behalf of the United States for deals. And I think part of that was the Abraham Accords. Had a large, if I remember correctly, a large track two component prior to, the official signing. All right. And then moving on to, unless you have something else to say on that, Jared.
Nope, I was going to move us on to Morocco. So the European Union initiated a 31% tariff on Moroccan automotive parts earlier this month due to evidence of dumping. Now, the Moroccan economists believe that this is not due to the the EU trying to hurt Morocco, but that this is Europe trying to strike at Chinese investment in these parts and thus trying to contain China, which really they expect what will happen is if Chinese divest from Morocco, the Europeans will chase China to wherever they go and invest to sanction them as well.
So this isn't like I think like we talked about earlier with Mexico and the pass-throughs that you reported on a few weeks ago. This isn't that, is what you're saying. This is targeting foreign direct investment.
Yes. And I think this is really interesting because this interplay between lesser states than like the US indicates that Europe's strategic anti-China goals largely align with the US, which you would expect being anti-China. And the idea that Europe is going to look for any other major power player I don't think it's viable. I think it really goes against reality when you just look at their actions. There's been a lot of talk about, if we're gonna have a lot of these maybe not anti-Europe, but if we're going to upset the European allies, they'll just go look for other investment. They'll turn to China. Well, here, no, they're not. They're trying to chase them out of Morocco. And even the Moroccans are looking at this saying, yes, they're trying to chase the Chinese out of here. So we should be maybe more open to European investment instead of Chinese investment.
All right. Well, let's move on to our warning items for today. In the first, in low intensity conflict news, multiple incendiary devices were found at an Austin, Texas Tesla dealership yesterday by the Austin, Texas Police Department. And they said that this was in response to an emergency call to the dealership for, I think they said, found or reported hazards. And the FBI also launched yesterday a task force in conjunction with the ATF. And they said this is to coordinate investigations of these Tesla attacks, which FBI Director Kash Patel in this announcement said that these Tesla attacks were domestic terrorism. Right now, I talked to Mike about this off the show. We've been talking about this for a few weeks now, and my assessment is that these are spontaneous. These are not necessarily centrally coordinated. The direct action part of this, and I think in this case, the evidence points to this being one of these, more far left anarchist type groups, like we saw with Stop Cop City, because of the use of this incendiary device, which is a tactic, technique, and procedure, or TTP, used by these groups that we saw heavily with Stop Cop City. And the previous, what I think is also probably more dangerous is we talked about the DOJ arresting or charging, some of these people who have been caught attacking Tesla's dealerships and charging stations, saying they're using Molotov cocktails, which I think points to, or as an indicator that politically activated individuals are being spurred to action by reporting on these attacks and media coverage and seemingly some media support of these attacks against Tesla. And so I think that these incidents are spontaneous self-activation or self-radicalization in the case of these lone wolf actors, rather than something that's organized behind the scenes by some kind of central planning committee for all of these groups. And it is a mix of these lone wolf and more organized left-wing groups conducting direct actions. That's not to say that there isn't some coordination of the protest side of the Tesla takedown. I think that's very likely some central coordination there with some left-leaning groups and nonprofits that are organizing the protests or facilitating organization and communications with these different Tesla takedown protests. All right, moving on, Jared, if you could come back on, we're going to talk about Chinese offshoring.
Yes, there are a couple interesting things about this. So we had talked about Chinese offshoring to actually even conducting pass-throughs or investing in other nations. Now, the Philippine Economic Zone Authority reports an uptick in Chinese multinational companies moving production into the Philippines. Now, this includes vitamins, dietary supplements, solar panels, electric vehicle manufacturers. And the PEZA believes this is actually due to U.S. tariffs on all imports from China. So that really means that they think China's trying to skirt the tariffs and they're expecting it. And I think there's more to this. I think if I were putting myself in China's shoes, what I would want to do to skirt tariffs is, yes, move into other nations, but also what that does is potentially goad the Trump administration into tariffing friendly nations like the Philippines. Now, I don't know if the Trump administration will fall for that, or if they'll do like what we saw with the Iranian oil, where they targeted specific Chinese companies, and thereby also, maybe they'll target specific like Filipino companies in this case. However, there's also more that goes on with this. So as we saw in the 2022 Ukraine war, seizing it, if foreign nations have assets on your land and you go to war with them, seizing them is still on the table. Now, China moving manufacturing out, I think can result in kind of accidentally giving these nations a rapid manufacturing capability, because China's sitting here investing in it, making manufacturing capability in these foreign nations, particularly when you're looking at the Philippines, who I'm expecting to be involved in a Taiwan contingency.
Have you seen any talk from any of these countries around China where they have moved main production or talking about moving production? Have they have they hinted at any that they could do this?
No,
is this too far in the future, and this is proposed?
This would be too far in the future. None of them are even proposing it, but keeping in mind when Russia invaded Ukraine, much of the European powers, which had not telegraphed, "Oh, we're going to do this," they seized, they seized oligarchs' yachts, stuff like that. You saw Russia take, plenty of American companies just seize their assets that were in Russia. Like I think McDonald's was one of the big ones. That's still on the table, even if it's not telegraphed. It's just a matter of, well, we're not going to allow you to continue to operate here. This is now ours. So I think that is still on the table, particularly as an act of war. And that would ultimately help the U.S. and its allies achieve an emergency supply chain shift away from China in the event of a Chinese move on Taiwan. And I can already kind of hear the questions of, well, hey, how could China allow that? That doesn't make sense. Despite the heavy government involvement, China still does allow CEOs to make some decisions. We saw that with the BlackRock and CK Hutchison deal, where they made that one and they were not focused on Chinese national security, and that blew up. Where in the short term, it could actually be framed as a matter of national security when the Chinese are okay with doing it because it skirts tariffs. It's just a matter of whether or not they think their assets would be seized, or they could have, the ability to make sure the assets are not seized.
All right. Thank you, Jared. Let's move on to our last warning item for the day. And this is an update on Japan's self-defense force.
Yes, Japan announced a new joint ground and maritime self-defense force unit near Hiroshima up there in the Kure naval base. And this is specifically to respond to a Taiwan contingency, which is the Japanese phrase for Chinese military action on Taiwan. And the force is going to have 10 brand new landing craft, all done by 2028. And the first 2 already launched last year. So they're well into the production cycle for this, and they intend to stand this up very rapidly. Now, this is a very important move for Japan. These ships demonstrate a greater commitment to Taiwan's defense than most other nations, potentially even the United States, because here Japan is just saying, we are prepared. We are committing a whole new force to intervening in a Taiwan contingency.
Do you think, just to interject real quick, because a big part of the discussion of Japanese politics that I, from my perspective over the last couple of years has been this, what seems to be a growing sentiment for remilitarization, effectively a Japanese nationalism. I think that was really kind of Shinzo Abe's thing, but there was still a lot of resistance to that. Do you think those political winds are changing, and that this could be a result of that there's a groundswell of sentiment for pro remilitarization?
So that's it's complicated. In short, yes, but no. I think in practical terms, you're going to see a rapid remilitarization of Japan, where they're even talking about potentially getting nuclear weapons. That's not very popular, but they have been rapidly building up their forces, and even their Japanese maritime self-defense force is an impressive navy that's not technically a navy. However, I don't think they will ever formally remilitarize, and the reason for that is that most of the Asian nations that are currently in the anti-China coalition still look at Japan and remember what they did in the mid-1900s and go, we don't want that again. So formally going, yes, this is the Japanese army, this is the Japanese navy, especially when you still have an emperor. So all of these would be the Imperial Japanese Army, Imperial Japanese Navy, would sit very poorly with like Korea or Vietnam.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Jared. Let's move on to questions and answers. We have a couple of questions already from, let's see, Griseo Nemo. Do these arsonists not realize those Teslas have cameras all over them? I think the more organized left-wing groups probably do, and that's why they're using these incendiary devices. They had, and they're not being caught. Like I don't think any kind of organized left-wing or far-left anarchist groups that use these TTPs have been caught yet, which is why they use those incendiary devices. In the case of some of these people who have been caught on camera, I think some of them don't know. They don't know that they have the Sentry mode, I think it's called, on the Teslas, and that's why they are conducting these, attacks against Tesla vehicles and charging stations as they are, with Molotov cocktails or shooting them or causing physical damage to them in other ways. I think that's a mix, and I think that's also part of the difference between these two types of actors in this case. is that the spontaneous, self-radicalized people or people who just see an attack of opportunity, a target of opportunity when they're walking in the grocery store parking lot, they don't consider that they're on camera, versus like the more sophisticated actors who probably do know about the Sentry mode. And then Bad Wabbit asks, is there a specified location for the federal land sale? So from what I see, this is kind of the beginning stages of this, potential land sale. And it's not one 625 square mile parcel. What they're doing is looking around BLM owned land in like small and large cities where they could build houses on to add housing capacity to, these cities. So I don't think there's been any release of specific areas, the specific parcels they're going to sell yet, but this is just it's not one single parcel as far as I've seen. All right. And from Erniel Cooper, how can we tell if all these investments that are being announced are real or just words to hold Trump back until he is out of office? What will Trump do if halfway through his term he sees this? I assume by he sees this, it's that he sees that these are not genuine investments in the United States. Well, I think part of it is the timeline. A lot of these companies are talking about putting the money in. They're, as we reported on some of this foreign direct investment, it's been on a timeline of like 2026 to 2028, which for beginning operations or getting construction underway. And I think also before Trump took office, something else I saw was that some of these companies in foreign companies, including in Korea, were concerned about the trade balances and their, ahead of Trump coming into office. So I think this is actually, they are concerned that the threat of tariffs is going to disrupt them as well. So they're trying to placate, but it's always a possibility that they're not, going to invest the money. But so far, I think the evidence points to they are genuinely going to invest this money.
I do want to step in here just to kind of point out that you also have to take into account that not everything is about the U.S. and tariffs. Like Taiwan was moving the semiconductor manufacturing company over way before Trump came back in for term 2. What they're doing there is essentially saying, well, it's not likely China's going to strike here. So this is the safe spot for our manufacturing. It's still ours, but this is where it's safest. And I think a lot of countries, particularly when you look at the Asian ones, that's what they're doing, is they're looking at this going, yeah, our entire nation runs the risk of being struck in the event of a war if it goes very bad. So let's make sure that we have some capability over here. We retain our manufacturing capacity, or at least the knowledge of it to some degree, so we can come back. That it's a matter of hedging your bet for strategic purposes, not just a matter of placating Trump. And I think we honestly would have been seeing a lot of those attempts from even the Asian or especially the Asian countries, even if Kamala Harris had won.
Yeah, that is another, we talk about this. There's been a lot of talk from officials and even private industry about this 2027 date. So I think there was a genuine sentiment from foreign companies and foreign governments to move these supply chains so that they're less vulnerable to disruption. Because over the last year, there was a lot of talk in these earnings calls and press releases from companies talking about geopolitical developments, and they're all basically hinting at some type of crisis with China that would disrupt their supply chain. So there is a long time, when I say long time, probably a couple of years knowledge in private industry that the supply chains are vulnerable to disruption because they're heavily reliant on China, or in some cases also within a geographical proximity to China where they could be disrupted if some kind of crisis kicks off.
Yeah, I do think it is telling that when you're looking at where they're investing, they're not getting cozier with China either. Because that would be the other option, is if you think a war is going to kick off, you just choose a side on which power player you think is going to win.
Yeah, I think the academic term for that is bandwagoning.
So, that's fair. That's fair. All right. And there was one question over at the Early Warning Network, which there's a link down below to start a 7-day trial if you guys want to join. Omega Joe over on the Early Warning Network asks, if Europe and others are, for now, dependent on the F-35 production, then is it correct to say that even with concerns about the built-in kill switch, they really have no alternative? And the short answer to that is yes. Yes, it is pretty much just you guys don't really have an alternative. If the Rafale ever gets really spun up and they can make nearly what the F-35 is making per month, then potentially, but that's a long time out.
Yeah, I think the impression that I've gotten over the last year, well, really since the Ukraine war kicked off, but especially over the last roughly year and a half, is that Europe's defense industrial base is significantly worse off than the United States. Like they've exported or they've sent a lot of military aid to Ukraine that drew down their own stockpile significantly. If I remember right, the UK has like 25 functional Challenger tanks, and this is I think in the long term they are. I agree. I think they are dependent on U.S. production for an effective modern fighter, because what was it you said yesterday? They want to move from 1 to like 3 fighters produced per month.
It was producing 2, aiming to produce 3 by next year, and exploring the options for potentially having 5 at some point. And Lockheed Martin produces a dozen already.
Yeah,
and they're going to increase.
And I think that goes to the larger point that we've made, is that well, not just us, but the larger point that peer versus near peer or peer versus peer conflict is dependent on this industrial production. And European economy, the European Union countries especially, were not prepared for this in any way. We're even worse off than the U.S. defense industrial base, because as we talked about before, the main barrier for expanding U.S. munitions production and U.S. military production is really regulatory. It's not a shortage of inputs, and we reported on that it's called gunpowder cotton production, and Europe's really heavily reliant, or was until China started curbing exports, really reliant on Chinese cotton for gunpowder production for nitrocellulose. And so they're just in a, I think, really bad position to try to ramp up their own domestic production, at least in the short term.
Yep. All right.
Well, if that's the last question for today, we'll be back with you tomorrow at 08 Central. Be safe and stay out front.